So today's topic of discussion is gastrointestinal bleeding. So the gastrointestinal bleeding comprises a wide range of diagnosis of multiple type of lesions. It's often an emergency, and management and outcome depend on the severity and the comorbidities. It's a team approach to manage it, and upper GI bleed accounts for more hospitalizations. Mortality rate annually is 2.5 to 3.5% for any type of GI bleed. Non-variceal upper GI bleed mortality rates is 5 to 10%. Despite the evolution of acid suppression therapy, rates are same for the past 2 decades, attributable to aging population with increased comorbid illness. Lower GI bleed mortality rates are 5%. So once the patient presents, first step is to assess the severity of the bleed, which is done by measuring the hemodynamic parameters, attempting to quantify the blood loss. So if the patient is in shock, that is resting hypotension, approximately he has lost 20 to 25% of the blood volume and the bleeding type is massive. If the patient has postural symptoms like orthostatic tachycardia or hypotension, then 10 to 20% of blood loss is there and the bleeding type is moderate. And if the patient vital signs are normal, then the blood loss is generally less than 10% and bleeding type is minor. So once the patient present, we do continuous monitoring of hemodynamics, which is necessary to guide the resuscitative efforts and provide the prognostic information. So first, 2 large bore IV cannulas are to be placed immediately to restore the euvolemia. An arterial line has to be done to see the actual blood pressure of the patient. Hematocrit on initial evaluation may not reflect the severity of bleed due to loss of both plasma and RBC. Hematocrit drops when hemodilution occurs as extravascular fluid enters vascular space to restore volume, and it may take 72 hours, and also it drops because of therapeutic hemodilution because of the fluids we give. So initial hematocrit is not suggestive of the amount of bleed, that we have to keep in mind. Rapidity of fluids and blood infusion depends on patient's cardiovascular status. So current transfusion trends are to administer blood to a patient with hemoglobin of less than 7 gram per dl and avoid transfusion when it is more than 10 gram per dl. A study evaluating blood transfusion for upper GI bleed found a significantly higher survival rate and lower rebleeding rate when restrictive transfusion threshold of 7 gram per dl was followed as compared to 9 gram per dl in 2013. The study was done. Okay, and patients with defects in platelets and coagulation factors, they have to be kept in mind that they have to be replaced. If patient is requiring massive transfusion of PRBCs, we have to replace platelet and FFP transfusion accordingly. Initial evaluation of suspected non-variceal bleed includes risk stratification to allow appropriate intervention. So in suspected non-variceal bleed, we have 2 scores which are validated, Blatchford and Rockall score, to tell us about the appropriate interventions and prognosis. So this is the Rockall numeric scoring system. The first 3, age, shock and comorbidity, are pre-endoscopic parameters, and diagnosis and major stigmata of recent hemorrhage are post-endoscopic parameters. So we have 0, 1, 2, 3 scores according to age, less than 60, 60 to 79, more than 80, shock, tachycardia and hypertension, comorbidities like cardiac failure, ischemic heart disease, any major comorbidity, renal failure, liver failure, disseminated malignancy, diagnosis like Mallory Weiss tear and malignancy has a higher score, and major stigmata, if we see none or dark spot, we give 0 score. If we give blood, an adherent clot and visible spotting vessel, we give 2. This is endoscopy. Yes. The last 2 are for post endoscopy and first 3 are pre-endoscopy scores. So a total score is ranged from 0 to 11 with a score of 2 representing the clinical cutoff, above which the patients are considered to be at high risk of death or rebleeding. So this tells about the prognosis. Okay, and this is the Blatchford score. Blatchford score includes the blood urea, hemoglobin for men and women at different thresholds, systolic blood pressure, pulse, more than 100, presentation with melena, presentation with syncope, hepatic diseases, cardiac failure. So in Blatchford, the total score is 0 to 23. A score of 0 is the clinical cutoff, above which patients are considered to be at risk of rebleeding on intervention. So these we have to do on presentation of the patient, so that we can tell the relatives about the outcome. So how can we suspect when the patient presents? We have done the initial resuscitation. How do we know what is the source of bleeding? So some clues we can get from history and clinical findings, like if it's a hematemesis, it typically points to an upper GI source proximal to the ligament of Treves. Rare cases of hematemesis may be due to swallowed blood from oropharyngeal nasal sources. That has to be kept in mind. Melena is defined as black tarry stool with glistening sheen resulting from degradation of blood in the GI tract. At least 50 ml of blood is needed for that, and usually it indicates upper GI bleed, but source may be small bowel. Coffee ground emesis is a typical sign of recent but currently inactive upper GI bleed. Its color is changed because acid affects the blood in lumen. And hematochezia is fresh red blood coming from the stool. It indicates colonic bleeding. It may be from a more proximal bleed, especially if the patient is hemodynamically unstable. We have to suspect it can be also because of upper GI bleed. Okay, if the patient has abdominal pain before or at the time of bleeding episode, it can point to peptic ulcer disease, mesenteric or colonic ischemia, perforation, intestinal infarction. If the patient has vomiting multiple times or retching, it can indicate Malady waist tear. If there is a previous history of bleeding from this peptic ulcer disease, esophageal or gastric varices, diverticulosis, we have to put these in DD. If there is a history of recent abdominal vascular surgery, chances of aortoenteric fistula. If the patient has known liver disease, varices, portal gastropathy. Elderly patients generally have diverticulosis, vascular ectasia, and young patients have varices, ulcers, esophagitis. Other drugs like NSAIDs, aspirin, and anticoagulation meds with underlying GI disease. Anticoagulant itself does not cause GI bleed, but if there is an underlying GI disease, they may precipitate it. Other medical conditions history is important for transfusion threshold, like if the patient is symptomatic with MI or hemodynamic instability, the transfusion threshold hemoglobin should be 10. If the hospitalized patient has pre-existing coronary artery disease, it should be 8. In acute coronary syndrome including acute MI, 8 to 10. In patients with hemodynamically stable patients in the ICU, 7. In GI bleed, hemodynamically stable, 7. Orthopedic surgery, 8, and cardiac surgery, 7.5. So, quick history and then quick physical examination ongoing with the resuscitation. The evidence of chronic liver disease, we see spider angiomata, gynecomastia, splenomegaly, ascites. These signs suggest portal hypertension. Telangiectasias may suggest the Osler-Weber-Rendu disease, that's hereditary hemorrhagic telangiectasia. Acanthosis nigrans, which are purplish velvety patches on the joints, sign of GI malignancy. Purpura can suggest vascular disease like hinox-spondyline purpura or polyarteritis nodosa. If the tenderness is present in abdomen with peritoneal signs, it may suggest the peptic ulcer disease, ischemia or perforation. And we have also do abdominal examination for organomegaly and masses. So nasogastric tube placement is a common practice but it's controversial. So presumed benefit of nasogastric tube placement is confirms the upper GI source. It predicts the high risk lesions. That's if the blood is coming, that means the reason is spurting or oozing lesion, which is high risk. And it leads in clearing up and better visualization during endoscopy. But in a retrospective study of the impact of performance of NG lavage, this practice was associated with earlier time to endoscopy but had no effect on mortality rate, length of hospital stay, surgery or transfusion requirements. So, if an upper endoscopy is planned in next 12 to 24 hours after presentation, NG lavage to be avoided owing to lack of proven benefit and major discomfort and pain inflicted to the patient. So diagnostic tests, initial laboratory evaluation, we sent CBC, liver enzymes, PT, blood urea nitrogen, creatinine, type and cross match, serial hematocrit. High total WBC may suggest ischemia and infarction. Thrombocytopenia may suggest portal hypertension. Elevated blood urea nitrogen disproportionate to creatinine may suggest upper GI bleed and any other cause of intravascular volume depletion. So blood gets absorbed when it passes through the GI tract, so urea increases disproportionately to the creatinine. Further diagnostic plan after initial resuscitation, specific plan like endoscopy, angiography, radionuclide scan and CT scanning has to be planned. So these are the DDs. So if the patient has peptic ulcer disease, is mostly in 50% of the patients. It includes gastric and duodenal ulcers, gastritis, duodenitis. Acid, H. pylori and NSAIDs are the most important factors, and pathogenesis is aneurysmal dilation with intense arteritis. Malady waist tear 5 to 15%, mucosal and submucosal lacerations caused by sudden increase in pressure within the cardia and lower esophagus by retching. Angiodysplasia 5 to 10% because of AV malformation. Diola foa lesion less than 5%. It is not a non-ulcerative lesion with a visible vessel protruding from a small mucosal defect seen on endoscopy. So benign and malignant neoplasm comprise less than 5%. Adeno-CA of esophagus, stomach, duodenum, squamous cell carcinoma of esophagus, GI stromal cell tumors, carcinoid tumors, lipomas. Aortoenteric fistula is seen mostly in the third portion of duodenum. and Herald bleed means a small amount of bleed will precede the torrential bleeding in aortoenteric fistula. That has to be kept in mind. Hemophilia may occur, is a rare cause because of instrumentation, recent history of instrumentation of hepatobiliary tree biopsy, and hemosuccus pancreatitis is a very rare cause. It's caused because of pseudoaneurysm formation and rupture in the duct in the patient with pancreatic pseudocyst. So and that was about the non-variceal bleed. Now the variceal bleed. Hepatic venous pressure gradient more than 5 mmHg. Varices develop most commonly in the distal esophagus and stomach, and esophageal varices are more common. Varicose hemorrhage occurs in a third of cirrhotic patients with varices and do not bleed generally unless the HVPG is more than 12 mmHg, as explained by Dr. Devottam in the previous class. And the risk factors associated with variceal bleed are degree of liver disease, child classification, higher grade, location, most common is gastroesophageal junction, and if the size is large. Gastric varices are of two groups: isolated gastric varices and gastroesophageal varices that are continuous with the esophageal varices and extending to cardia type 1 or to the fundus type 2. So GEV1 was a more common type of gastric varix, but isolated gastric varices were the type that bleeds the most. So once we from the history and physical examination we have a clue, and then we have resuscitate the patient, we go for endoscopy. So after the initial evaluation, resuscitation, stabilization, effort is directed at localization and treatment of the hemorrhage. So endoscopy has become the preferred diagnostic and therapeutic modality for upper GI bleed because of its accuracy and low complication rate. So we use a pro-motility agent such as metoclopramide and IV erythromycin, 250 mg by IV bolus or 3 mg per kg over a 30-minute period before the endoscopic examination. It significantly improves the mucosal visibility by promoting gastric motility and emptying of the gastric contents. So optimal timing of endoscopy remains a balance between clinical needs and resources, and guidelines for American and European societies recommend the performance of upper endoscopy within 24 hours in patients with suspected non-variceal upper GI bleed and within 12 hours in patients with high risk clinical features like tachycardia, hypotension, bloody emesis or nasogastric aspirate in the hospital. One major role of endoscopy is to identify the stigmata of recent hemorrhage known to correlate well with the increased risk of rebleeding and thus the need for endoscopic therapy. So these are the stigmata of ulcer hemorrhage findings on endoscopy. If we find a spurter or a oozer, chances of rebleeding is 85 to 90%. If a protuberant vessel is seen, 35 to 55%. Adherent clot, 30 to 40%. Flat spot, 5 to 10%, and none, then 5%. Non-endoscopic assessment: when endoscopy cannot be performed, has not yielded a definitive diagnosis, angiography and radionuclide imaging may be useful alternatives. Such endoscopic failures are most often related to anatomic situations preventing full endoscopy. So therapeutic alternatives in non-variceal bleeding. So in non-variceal bleeding, acid suppression has been shown to play a role in the inactivation of pepsin, optimization of platelet function and inhibition of fibrinolysis. Subsequently, clot stabilization and ulcer healing may be more effective and rapid within a less acidic environment. This constitutes a rationale for acid suppressive therapy in patients with bleeding peptic ulcers. In patients found to have high risk lesions treated endoscopically, the guidelines recommend an IV bolus followed by continuous infusion PPI therapy. The use of continuous infusion therapy is supported by the data showing that intragastric pH at greater than 6 after endoscopic hemostasis is associated with lowest rebleeding rates, and that this goal can be achieved only by bolus administration of a PPI followed by a constant infusion. Another is a reduction in splanchnic blood flow with somatostatin and its analogues is an attractive measure, but to date no available data is there to suggest us to use these drugs in non-variceal upper GI bleed. Endoscopic therapy for non-variceal upper GI bleed with high risk lesions has been shown to reduce the rate of rebleeding, need for surgery and mortality rate. It is indicated in patients with active bleeding, spurting arterial vessels and non-bleeding visible vessels in an underlying ulcer. So when a clot is found in an ulcer bled during endoscopy, targeted irrigation in an attempt at dislodgement is done with the treatment of the underlying lesion. If the clot remains adherent after irrigation, endoscopic therapy may be considered, but intense PPI therapy alone may be sufficient. Different forms of endoscopic therapy include injection technique, thermal technique, mechanical technique and topical spray. So injection therapy results in hemostasis probably from a combination of vascular tamponade and pharmacologic effect of the injected agent. So agents used for injection include normal saline solution, epinephrine, sclerosants such as ethanol, ethanolamine and polidocanol. Thermal energy can be delivered through non-contact techniques such as the neodymium, yttrium, aluminium, garnet and argon lasers, and APC, argon plasma coagulation, and contact technique like the pottery, monopolar and bipolar heater probes. Mechanical therapy refers to the use of device that causes physical tamponade of the bleeding site like metallic clips, sewing devices, rubber band ligation and endoloops. And topical hemostatic sprays have been recently introduced with promising results. They consist of absorbent powder that rapidly concentrates the clotting factors at the bleeding site. Now, if the endoscopy is we're not able to do the angiographic therapy, in angiographic or transcatheter intervention case, in the cases of upper GI bleed, involves two techniques: infusion of vasoconstricting medications and mechanical occlusion. Vasopressin infusion induces vasoconstriction and results in cessation of bleeding in 70 to 80% of the cases initially, but rebleeding occurs in up to 20%. So transcatheter embolization has become the mainstay for the radiographic treatment of non-variceal upper GI bleed and ranks second after endoscopic therapy in most centers. The embolic material used can be temporary, such as gelatin, sponge or autologous clot, or permanent, such as coils. Surgical therapy: the main goal of surgery is control of active bleeding and prevention of exsanguination with a secondary aim to prevent recurrent ulceration. So truncal vagotomy with antrectomy and vagotomy with pyloroplasty are examples of operations performed in case of non-variceal upper GI bleeding. Because the recurrent ulcers can be prevented by NSAIDs, by avoiding NSAIDs and eliminating H. pylori if present, or administrating PPIs, most ulcer operations for acute bleeding focus on oversewing the ulcer rather than performing the more definitive surgeries just listed. So in variceal bleeding, therapeutic if you find a variceal bleeding, the therapeutic alternative is pharmacotherapy. The pharmacologic agents used in the treatment of acute variceal bleeding aim at reducing the portal pressure by decreasing the portal blood flow and reducing the intrahepatic resistance. Vasopressin, terlipressin, somatostatin and somatostatin analog, octreotide and lanreotide all induce constriction of the splanchnic vasculature and result in decrease in the portal blood flow. So vasopressin causes systemic vasoconstriction as well as splanchnic vasoconstriction and can lead to adverse effects such as MI and CVAs. So it is generally avoided alone. Terlipressin is a synthetic analog of vasopressin with a longer duration of action and fewer side effects. Unlike other vasoactive agents, terlipressin has been shown to reduce the mortality rate when compared with placebo. At present, it is not available or approved by US FDA. The dose normally is 2 mg IV 4 hourly, then 1 mg IV 4 hourly once the hemorrhage is controlled. Somatostatin is a naturally occurring peptide, induces splanchnic vasoconstriction without affecting the systemic circulation and thus results in decrease in the portal pressure. So dose is 250 microgram bolus and 250 microgram per hour for 3 to 5 days. And octreotide, a somatostatin analog, is approved for use in variceal bleeding in United States at present because of its excellent safety profile and easy availability. Octreotide 50 microgram bolus followed by 50 microgram per hour continuous infusion for 3 to 5 days is used in conjunction with endoscopic therapy. Antibiotics: the use of prophylactic antibiotics in patients with variceal bleeding has been shown to decrease the mortality rate in several randomized controlled trials. The rationale is that most of the patients have bacterial infection, about 20% patients of cirrhosis, and when they are in the hospital, infection may develop in at least 50% of the patients. An updated meta-analysis showed that antibiotic prophylaxis significantly reduced the all-cause mortality, bacterial infection, mortality rate, rebleeding events and length of hospital stay. So non-absorbable antibiotics, quinolones and more recently cephalosporins have all been used with good success. In endoscopic therapy in the variceal bleeding, mainly two types are there: endoscopic sclerotherapy and endoscopic band ligation. They result in achieving hemostasis in 80 to 90% of the patients. So sclerotherapy consists of intravariceal or paravaricial injection of a sclerosant agent such as sodium tetradecyl sulfate or ethanolamine. These agents provoke a severe inflammatory reaction within or around the varix that leads to variceal thrombosis and obliteration. Complications range from local effects such as deep ulcers causing rebleeding, odynophagia, and in some cases perforation, to bacteremia and systemic complications such as pleural and pericardial effusion. Endoscopic band ligation consists of placement of a ligating device on the tip of the endoscope and elastic rings are placed over the targeted varix. So band ligation has a lower rate of complication than sclerotherapy, but it can be difficult to perform during acute bleeding. Transient chest discomfort and dysphagia are common after band ligation, and band ligation also has the advantage of achieving eradication of the varices with fewer endoscopic sessions than are typically needed for sclerotherapy. So, a practical guideline by American Association for the Study of Liver Diseases recommends the use of endoscopic band ligation as the preferred form of endoscopic therapy and the use of sclerotherapy when band ligation is not technically feasible. So, this is a picture of endoscopic band ligation in the varices, esophageal varices, blue colored bands. Yeah. So, the management of gastric varices depends on their location. The GEV1, that's the gastroesophageal varices extending to the cardia, are managed the same way as the esophageal varices. Banding is not effective for isolated gastric varices and the gastric varices extending to fundus. Fundic varices are usually treated with injection of cyanoacrylate glue. However, although used extensively in Europe and Asia with excellent outcomes, cyanoacrylate glue is not approved by the US FDA. Balloon tamponade. So, use of balloon tamponade in the control of active variceal bleeding comes as a last resort when other forms of therapy are not available or fail to achieve homeostasis. 3 types of balloons have been used: the Minnesota tube, the Sengstegen-Blakemore tube, and the Linton-Nachlas tube. So, major concern with the use of these tubes is the high risk of rebleeding after deflation of the balloon, in addition to the risk of esophageal rupture. So, balloon tamponade should be used only as a temporary means of stabilization and as a bridge to a more definitive form of therapy. So, this is a Sengstegen-Blakemore tube with a esophageal balloon inflation port, the gastric inflation port, and the gastric aspiration port. So, the tube is passed to at least a 50 centimeter mark, and the gastric balloon is then inflated with the recommended 450 to 500 ml of air, and then a chest radiograph is done to see the position, and then it is pulled back gently until the resistance is felt against the diaphragm. If bleeding persists from the aspiration port, that means esophageal varices is also there. So, esophageal balloon is inflated to a lowest pressure needed to stop bleeding, 30 to 45 mmHg. And we have to keep in mind that we have to deflate the esophageal balloon every 4 to 6 hourly to avoid esophageal necrosis. The Minnesota tube also has an esophageal aspiration port. That's the difference with the Sengstegen-Blakemore tube. Esophageal stenting is another type of therapy. A recent randomized controlled trial compared balloon tamponade with the use of esophageal covered metal stent in patients with cirrhosis and acute refractory esophageal variceal hemorrhage. Success of therapy defined as 15-day survival without serious adverse effects or GI bleeding was significantly more frequent in the esophageal stent group. So, moreover, control of bleeding was higher and transfusion requirements and serious adverse effects were lower in the esophageal stent group. So, tips: the transtubular intrahepatic portosystemic shunt involves it involves the creation of a low resistance channel between the portal vein and the hepatic vein through which the blood is shunted from the portal to the systemic circulation. So, via an angiographic technique, an expandable metal stent is deployed across this channel and results in significant decrease in portal pressure. The TIPS procedure is indicated in situations in which acute variceal bleeding is refractory to endoscopic and pharmacologic therapy. It has been shown to control bleeding in more than 90% of patients with a rebleeding rate of less than 20%. And a major complication associated with this procedure is the development of encephalopathy in 10 to 20% of the patients. Surgical therapy, various forms of surgical shunts include portocaval shunts, distal splenorenal shunts, and partial shunts. Revascularization of the esophagus is another surgical option for treatment of variceal bleeding. At present, surgery is considered only when the medical and endoscopic therapy fails to control bleeding and TIPS procedure is not available. Stress-related mucosal disease is another cause of upper GI bleed, and the term stress-related mucosal disease covers a spectrum of conditions ranging from superficial mucosal damage to focal deep mucosal damage, that is stress ulcers. So, SRMD is defined as mucosal abnormalities of the upper GI tract that occur with extreme physiologic stress, typically in the ICU. Adequate microcirculation in the upper GI tract is the most important defense mechanism. So, adequate microcirculation in the upper GI tract is the most important defense mechanism against luminal aggressors such as acid and enzyme secretion as well as infection. In the presence of severe physiologic stress, disruption of the intramucosal blood flow leads to a number of events including the formation of toxic oxygen-derived radicals, a decrease in the synthesis of cytoprotective prostaglandins and mucus production, and a reduction in bicarbonate secretion, resulting in an increase in intramural acidity. So, a landmark study by Cook and Associates demonstrated a significant increase in the risk of bleeding from stress-related mucosal disease in patients requiring mechanical ventilation for more than 48 hours and in those with coagulopathy. Coagulopathy defined as platelet count less than 50,000 and INR above 1.5 or partial thromboplastin time more than 2 times the control value. Other risk factors such as shock, sepsis, renal failure, liver failure and glucocorticoids were identified, but association with bleeding was not statistically significant. So mechanical ventilation for more than 48 hours and coagulopathy, these are main risk factors. So reported mortality rates in critically ill patients with bleeding from SRMD ranges from 46 to 77%, although it's attributable to other causes also, but still it's significant. So what's the prophylaxis for stress-related mucosal disease in the ICU? Enteral nutrition. The rationale behind the use of enteral nutrition derives from its ability to improve the blood flow to the stomach and sustain the mucosal immunity and integrity. Sucralfate. The use of sucralfate for the prevention of bleeding in patients with SRMD gained interest because of theoretical concern about gram-negative bacterial overgrowth when the pH of the stomach is increased by the use of histamine 2 receptor agonists or PPIs, which can potentially lead to nosocomial pneumonia. But then IV H2RAs are most widely used pharmacologic agents for the prophylaxis of bleeding in patients with SRMD. One major concern is the development of tolerance to H2RAs when administered for a prolonged period. And in recent years, PPIs have gained a wider use in the prevention of bleeding from SRMD because of their ease of dosing, effective and predictable acid suppression, lack of need for regular gastric pH monitoring and lack of tolerance as encounters with H2S. So we use only PPIs, but for knowledge perspective, I have included the reasons for the other ones. So this is the pathophysiology of stress ulcers. Critical illness causes increased catecholamines and pro-inflammatory cytokine release, which leads to decreased cardiac output and splanchnic hypoperfusion, leading to reduced bicarbonate secretion, reduced mucosal blood flow, decreased GI motility and acid bag diffusion, leading to acute stress ulcer. So treatment is the same: endoscopy, same technique as for peptic ulcer disease, angiography and surgery. Lower GI bleed. So lower GI bleed is defined as bleeding that originates from a source distal to the ligament of Treves. It is caused by a diverse range of bleeding sources and can range from trivial to life-threatening bleeding. It can be acute, arbitrarily defined as less than 3 days duration, possibly resulting in hemodynamic compromise, or chronic, extending over a period of several days or longer, and usually less severe in terms of the amount of blood loss. So differential diagnosis is diverticular bleeding. Most common is the diverticular bleeding, when accounting for up to 40% of the cases. It affects mainly elderly older than 80 years, and patients with diverticular bleeding typically have painless hematochezia. Bleeding is thought to occur after repetitive trauma to the vasa recta, that's nutrient arteries that stretch over the diverticular dome. Ischemic colitis and other forms of colitis is also important cause of lower GI bleed. 19% cases. It results from sudden reduction in the mesenteric blood flow. As opposed to acute mesenteric ischemia, this reduction is transient and reversible. The typical regions affected are the watershed areas of the colon, the splenic flexure, the rectosigmoid junction and the right colon. So clinically, the patients have a sudden onset abdominal pain followed by hematochezia within 24 hours. So most cases of ischemic colitis resolve spontaneously with supportive treatment. Rare cases require surgery if the peritoneal signs are present, or develop chronic ischemic colitis with stricture formation. Other types of colitis are infectious colitis, radiation colitis, inflammatory bowel disease. They can also result in bloody diarrhea. Angiodysplasia is also important. Estimates are that they vary widely and reach 37% for the cause of lower GI bleed in some reports, but current data suggests that acute bleeding caused by angiodysplasia is less frequent than previously thought, in most cases demonstrating iron deficiency anemia and occult blood loss. So overt bleeding is usually brisk and painless and cannot be distinguished from diverticular bleeding. And endoscopic treatment is highly effective and safe and prevents bleeding episodes from recurring. Other sources are cancer and polyps, post-polypectomy bleeding, anorectal sources including hemorrhoids, anorectal fissures, circular ulcer and proctitis, and small bowel sources have also to be kept in mind, that include angiodysplasia, lymphomas, small bowel ulcers and Crohn's disease. So in lower GI bleed, after stabilization and resuscitation, we do diagnostic evaluation by colonoscopy, and bowel preparation is generally recommended before urgent colonoscopy to improve visibility and prevent complications related to poor visibility. So polyethylene glycol lavage solution by mouth or through nasogastric tube is commonly used in these cases, and it can be administered at a rate of approximately 1 liter every 30 to 45 minutes. And recent guideline acute lower GI bleeding recommends the performance of colonoscopy within 24 hours of patient presentation in patients with high risk clinical features and signs and symptoms of ongoing bleeding, as this approach can potentially improve diagnostic and therapeutic yields. Radionuclide scanning is also another method which can detect the bleeding rate as low as 0.05 to 0.1 ml per minute, but the main disadvantage is that it lacks therapeutic capability and it can delay other diagnostic and therapeutic procedures. Angiography, as in upper GI bleed, it can be used here also. It can detect bleeding at the rate of 0.5 to 1 ml per minute. In addition to its role in accurate localization of bleeding lesions, it offers therapeutic possibilities in the same way as in the upper GI bleed. CT angiography helps in accurate localization of the bleed before going for the actual angiography and therapy through the angioembolization. So therapies in the endoscopy, the same methods are used as in upper GI bleed and include thermal therapy and mechanical therapy. And clipping is, several studies show that clipping is very effective modality for diverticular bleeding with a low rate of early rebleeding. And angiographic therapy is same, transcatheter embolization with the current super selective techniques using gelatin sponge, microcoils and polyvinyl alcohol particles. And surgery is indicated in case of recurrent bleeding, especially diverticular and massive ongoing bleeding with high transfusion requirements, more than 6 units of packed IVC 24-hour period. And colonoscopy and angiography may be used as a guide to localization of the bleeding lesion for guiding the surgeon. So obscure GI bleed. Obscure GI bleed is means we don't know where the source is. So obscure bleeding can be occurred, that's positive fecal occurred blood testing without frank recognizable blood loss, or overt, that's clinically evident. So mixed lesions on upper and lower endoscopy should be considered first in the workup of the obscure bleeding. So causes difficult to identify on routine endoscopy include hemosuccus pancreaticus, hemobilia, aortoenteric fistula, dura four ulcer and extraesophageal varices. And small bowel tumors like lymphoma, carcinoids, adenocarcinomas, vascular ectasia, NSAID-induced ulcers and Meckel's diverticulum. So how do? We repeat the upper and lower endoscopy is usually warranted at least once after an index endoscopy. When the patient is active ongoing bleeding, radionuclide scanning and angiography should be considered. Small bowel push enteroscopy can be very useful in identifying and in some cases treating lesions in the small bowel that are responsible for obscure bleeding. Unfortunately, it can examine only 50 to 150 centimeter of the small bowel. Capsule endoscopy has gained great interest in evaluation of the small bowel because of its ability to examine the entire small bowel and its non-invasive nature. And exploratory laparotomy is generally the last option in the evaluation of obscure GI bleed, and combined with intraoperative enteroscopy, the diagnostic yield reaches 50 to 100%. So conclusion in summary, acute GI bleed is a life-threatening emergency that requires a quick response and coordinated team approach. Acute management is same regardless of the source of bleeding. Once the source is suspected, specific management and therapeutic options are considered and may require communication with gastroenterologist, surgeon and interventional radiologist. And endoscopic therapy with standard and innovative techniques has been shown to have a major impact on the prognosis of bleeding patients. So this is in a nutshell the chart of for upper GI bleed and lower GI bleed. In upper, it's visible, it's not visible. Basically, when we suspect upper GI bleed, as we do an NG lavage. If the NG lavage, is it visible, sir? There are 3 steps. We do an NG lavage. If the blood is not clearing, we suspect active bleeding. If the blood is clearing in the NG lavage, the bleeding is not active. Then with the history and physical examination, if we suspect the peptic ulcer disease, we start PPI drip. If we suspect varices, we start octreotide drip. And simultaneously, we put 2 large bore IV lines and send the blood work. We assess the hemodynamics. If the patient is normal hemodynamic, we may plan an early endoscopy within 24 hours. If the patient is in shock or postural hypotension, we start resuscitation, and once the patient becomes stable, we can do endoscopy within 24 hours. If the patient remains unstable, then we do an emergency endoscopy as soon as the resources are steady. In endoscopy, if we see the pelvic ulcer, this peptic ulcer disease, we with a low risk of rebleeding, we treat the potential causes, H. pylori, NSAIDs, and give the oral PPI. If the lesion with high risk of rebleeding is seen in the peptic ulcer disease, we do endoscopic treatment and start the PPI drip. In varices, we do the endoscopic treatment, continue octreotide drip, start antibiotics and stop the PPI drip if started before. If no source is identified and there is blood in the stomach and duodenum, we repeat the endoscopy in 24 hours, and no blood in stomach and duodenum, we consider colonoscopy and video capsule endoscopy and device assisted enteroscopy, other forms. Okay, if after all this the bleeding continues, the interventional radiology consultation or tips is for varices, and for this peptic ulcer disease, radiology consultation for possible intervention. Okay, and in lower GI bleed also the same hemodynamics, we put resuscitate, we see the hemodynamics. If the patient is normal vital signs, then we can do we can observe the patient, and if the bleeding stop, we can do a colonoscopy after preparation. If the patient is unstable, we do a NG lavage to exclude the upper GI source, and simultaneously we do a surgical consultation, and we continue the crystalloid and the blood transfusion. If the patient remains unstable, we can do an angiography, in angiographic treatment, and consider surgery. If the patient angiography is negative, we can go for colonoscopy after preparation. Colonoscopy without preparation is very controversial. It's not nowhere definitive. Nobody has said that it can be done. So this is thank you.
People were worried that if you give them bread before the colonoscopy, they might be some hemodialysis. So it has been shown that it doesn't matter. It's better to give them a bread and do a colonoscopy properly. Otherwise, most of the time when you do a colonoscopy, it is actually really intensive in the time. You can't visualize the mucosum. It is difficult to
See.
visualize. So, you see, one of the things that happen in our practice is we tend to over-transfuse. It is important to remember that the target hemoglobin in most of the situations is 7 to 7.5. It is not more than that. A landmark paper in the NEJM has shown that if you over-transfuse them, their mortality and surgery increases. It is important not to over-transfuse. The target hemoglobin should not be more than 7.5. Unless and until you have other comorbidities, your cardiac disease, that is different. This is the common. We tend to give them only 9, our target. We should not do that. It is very important to give them that. In NGP, we don't do now. It is
Out.
obsolete. Nobody uses NGP. The endoscopic therapies nowadays are very effective. Inventive scripts, somebody has got a spotter. It's not very difficult to use, but they're expensive. Each clip costs you about 4 to 5,000 rupees. If you have to put 2 or 3 clips, it is about 15,000 rupees. That you have to keep in mind. And radionuclide scanning is one of the use. You do the CT angio or a angio acid. And in the vericium bleeding, again the target should be 7 to 7.5, not more than that. Because it has been shown that if you over-transfuse them, then bleeding increases. Because the
Portal pressure
increases.
increases.
That is very important. And you should not forget about giving an antibiotic. Antibiotic has shown to reduce mortality. Then to just concentrate on bleeding, you tend to forget the antibiotic. It is extremely important to add an antibiotic. This is the ceftriaxone. That you have to keep in mind. And sclerotherapy, I am not done sclerotherapy in last 10 years.
Okay, obsolete.
Sclerotherapy is no longer used because of the complications it causes. We use the
And ligation.
with experience, you can use banding in most of the situations. It is rare to that you cannot visualize and see. So sclerotherapy is very not used for all practical purposes. And if you can't control the bleeding or if they bleed again, then you have to think of doing other therapy. It's something like that. Nowadays there is a stent available. Because tips requires quite a lot of skill. It's not available everywhere. So if you have to transport a patient somewhere else, it's not available in your institution. So there is a stent available. It's an expandable stent. In an emergency situation, you can put the stent down. It is expensive. And you can keep it for 48 to 72 hours. And then you have to take it out. It buys you time to do a definitive tip setup.
Stent between systemic and portal circulation.
Yes, stent is the mechanical pressure on the esophagus.
Okay, for like a tamponade.
Yes.
For tamponade effect.
Because balloons are no longer used.
Esophageal stenting.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Minestrone and Sengstack and Glencore are no
Not
longer
used.
because of the complications.
Complications.
Absolutely. So we tend to use a stent
For bridging.
for bridging before a definitive therapy. And for gastric varices bleeding, you have to use glue. And if the glue fails to complete, the problem with the glue is embolization. If you put a glue, it can dislodge from the gastric varices, and it can go to lungs and cause infarction. So that is why it has not been approved by FDA. So if you can't control the glue, Then there is another endoscope, there is another radiological technique called VRTA, by which you can control the bleeding. But again, it is available only in few centers. You have to be highly specialized. So people have to be trained. Interventional radiologists who do this, only, there are very few of them in Calcutta. And varices bleeding, the outcome in the varicose bleeding is dominantly dependent upon their liver disease. Mortality is directly related to the liver disease. If the liver disease is advanced, even if you control the bleeding, but the mortality is up. So, and there is a new thing called an emergency or preventive tips. People have shown that if somebody bleeds due to varices, and if you measure their AQPDA during just after the bleeding, after the endoscopy, and if the AQPD is more than 20, then if you do a tips on that, then it reduces mortality. The problem with tips is, as you said, encephalopathy, and because it is bypassing the liver function worsens. Most of the blood is bypassing the liver. Tips is not a very benign procedure in such situations. And the other thing is, in the lower GI bleed, mostly, relatively, you don't have to do much. It settles by itself. Then you have to try and find a cause. In elderly patients, diverticula is the common problem. Otherwise, if you get angiodysplasia, you can do an EPC. And the obscure bleed is difficult because at times we have patients who have recurrent bleed and you can't find. You've done upper GI, you've done a lower GI, and still you can't find a cause. Then you have to look at the small bar. There are newer techniques called double balloon interoscopy, spiral interoscopy. You can see a lot of not the bar completely small bar, but you can see 2/3 of the small bar. And then the capsule. Have a look at the capsule and see. And once you find, then you have to do appropriate therapy. Commonest that we see is Crohn's disease. Crohn's disease presents like that. Sometimes there, but when we do a capsule to find out Crohn's disease, then we keep capsule.
How do you measure this aspiration?
I was also having this question.
It is not very difficult. You put a catheter interventricular, you go down the right atrium, enter into the hepatic vein, inferior vena cava, hepatic vein, and you wedge it.
PSC की तरह. Like a PSC.
Just
Pulmonary artery catheter
just go and wedge it and give it the pressure. That will tell you that. Tips is quite difficult to do. It is not an easy procedure to do. You have to be trained in doing tips.
Because how do you do this BRTO technique?
You see, BRTO is basically the whole idea of BRTO is the gastric varices, especially the fundic varices. They bleed because of the splenic vein, branches from the splenic and the left sided branches. And usually they have a communication with the renal vein. You do a CT before and see there are extra communication between the splenic system or the portal system and the renal vein. Okay? When you pass the catheter, go through the renal vein, retrogradely you go.
Okay.
And then you do embolization or whatever the system. So unless and until there is a communication between the renal system and the portal system, you can't do it. But most of the time, those who bleed because of the gastric varices, they have this communication. You have to do a CT before that, just to find out these channels, whether these channels exist or not.
It's all high tech. In a DGH where you won't have all those intervention gastroenterologists. If you bleed only, apart from giving blood transfusion.
When you do blood transfusion, you do as you don't use octreotide nowadays. You can use sterilic acid. because it is a bolus, and as you said, it has been shown to reduce mortality. Unlike octreotide.
This is the lactate level.
Octreotide and
This is the
somatic.
lactate level.
Octreotide is used in US because they don't have a license for 30%.
30%. Actually, 30% is better.
So 30% is better because it reduces mortality. The only drug which is shown to reduce mortality is 30%. So you control the bleeding. Either by 30% if you take
And name was surgeon.
no surgery. So because people who have a liver disease, the mortality is high.
Non-hepatic disorders.
In the critical consultation, the interventional radiologist will just identify the branch of the gastroduodenal and
Interventional
Embolization.
say, na?
yes, you need an intervention. But most of the situation in peptic ulcer disease, you can control it endoscopy. Rarely it happens. Once in a year or something. Once in 2 years you find something. But nowadays you get newer DOACs. This has become a problem. In the West.
Reversibility.
It becomes difficult. You don't have a reversal agent.
Reversal agent.
And then it becomes difficult to control.
Technology, no? Good.